She didn't go to the auction looking for beauty. She went looking for something else entirely. Something the world had already thrown away. The morning was cold and gray when Margaret stood in the back corner of the Henderson County livestock auction, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a coat that had seen better days. Around her, farmers talked in low voices about bloodlines and egg production rates, about Rhode Island Reds and Leghorns with perfect combs and glossy feathers. They were there for the good birds, the pretty birds. The birds that would win ribbons at the county fair and fill cartons with uniform white eggs. But Margaret wasn't looking at those cages. She was looking at the last row. The row nobody wanted to stand near. The row where 50 hens huddled together in a single wire pen, their feathers patchy and torn, their combs pale and drooping, their eyes dull with the kind of exhaustion that comes from places no living creature should ever see. These were the spent hens from the Millerbrook Egg Factory, the ones who had spent 18 months in battery cages, so small they couldn't spread their wings, the ones who had been fed just enough to keep them laying, day after day, until their bodies started to give out. The ones the factory was liquidating for 50 cents apiece because they were considered worthless. Broken, used up, the auctioneer called out the lot. 50 hens. Opening bid, $25. The crowd laughed. Someone muttered that you'd have to be desperate or crazy to buy those walking skeletons. Another man said they were so scrawny a fox wouldn't even bother taking one. The woman beside Margaret shook her head and said it would be kinder to just put them out of their misery right there. Margaret raised her hand. 25, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. The auctioneer looked at her, surprised. Do I hear 30? Silence. Going once, going twice, sold to the lady in the green coat for $25. They laughed at her all the way to the parking lot. They laughed at her as she loaded 50 featherless, terrified birds into the back of her rusted pickup truck. They laughed at her as she drove away, the hens clucking softly in the bed, confused by the sudden presence of sunlight and air. They called her foolish. They called her naive. They said those birds were dead already. They just didn't know it yet. But Margaret had seen something in those dull eyes that the others hadn't. She had seen a spark, a tiny, stubborn ember of life that hadn't been extinguished yet. And she knew, with a certainty she couldn't explain, that sometimes the most broken things hold the most extraordinary secrets. Margaret was 53 years old, though the mirror had been telling her she looked closer to 60 for a while now. She lived alone on 7 acres of land that had belonged to her grandmother, a small farmhouse with a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle and a barn that had more holes in the roof than shingles. The land was good land, rich Midwestern soil that had grown wheat and corn for generations, but Margaret had never been a farmer. She had been a librarian. For 30 years she had worked at the county library, organizing books, recommending stories to children, helping old men find the history of their tractors. It was a quiet life, a good life, a life she thought she would live until she retired with a pension and a small garden. Then the library closed. Budget cuts, they said, consolidation. Her position was deemed unnecessary. The pension she had counted on was reduced to a fraction of what she had been promised. The medical bills from her husband's final illness, 2 years gone now, still sat in a drawer in the kitchen, a stack of paper that seemed to grow heavier every month. She had taken the buyout. She had taken the part-time job at the grocery store, stocking shelves at night. She had taken the humiliation of applying for assistance she never thought she would need. And every morning she had sat on that sagging porch with her coffee, staring at the 7 acres that had once represented security and now felt like a weight around her neck. She couldn't afford to keep the land. She couldn't afford to sell it, not in this market, not with the barn falling down and the well needing repair. She was trapped in a life that was shrinking around her day by day, bill by bill. Her daughter, Sarah, called every Sunday from Chicago. Sarah was practical. Sarah had a condo and a 401k and a husband who worked in finance. Sarah meant well, but her voice carried that particular tone of worry that mothers recognize immediately, the tone that says, "I love you, but you're embarrassing me. Mom, you need to sell that place and move into town. There's a nice senior community near the hospital. You can't keep living out there alone. Mom, those hens are a waste of money you don't have. You need to be practical, Mom. Everyone is talking about you at the auction. They say you've lost your mind." Margaret didn't argue. She had learned that arguing with people who have already decided you're crazy is like trying to teach a stone to sing. But she also knew something that Sarah didn't, something that the farmers at the auction didn't, something that even she herself was only beginning to understand. She knew what it felt like to be thrown away. She knew what it felt like to have your best years extracted from you, day after day, until someone decided you weren't productive enough anymore. She knew what it felt like to stand in a pen while the world looked at you and saw nothing but waste. Those hens weren't just birds to her. They were mirrors. And she had made a decision, standing there in the cold morning air, that she would not let them die without ever having known what it meant to be alive. She would not let them end their days as a line item on a factory spreadsheet. If she was going down, she was going down fighting for them, and in some way she couldn't yet articulate for herself. The first week was harder than she had imagined. She had prepared the old barn as best she could, patching the worst of the holes, laying down fresh straw, setting up nesting boxes made from wooden crates she found behind the hardware store. She read everything she could find online about rehabilitating battery hens. She learned that their bodies were depleted of calcium, that their immune systems were compromised, that many of them had never walked on grass or seen the sun. She learned that some would die no matter what she did, their bodies too broken to recover. She named them all, every single one. It took 3 days, standing in the barn with a notebook, watching them stumble and fall, watching them peck at the dirt with a confusion that broke her heart. There was Dorothy, who had almost no feathers on her back and walked with a pronounced limp. There was Beatrice, who was so thin her breastbone stuck out like a knife edge. There was Clara, who didn't move for the first 2 days, who just sat in the corner with her eyes closed, waiting to die. Margaret fed them a special diet she researched, layer mash supplemented with black soldier fly larvae for protein, crushed oyster shells for calcium, fresh greens she chopped by hand every morning. She added apple cider vinegar to their water. She sat with them for hours, talking in a low voice, letting them get used to her presence. She didn't try to touch them. She knew they had been handled by machines, not hands. They didn't know what a gentle touch felt like. The neighbors started coming by. Tom Henderson, who farmed the 40 acres to the east, was the first. He leaned on his fence post, chewing a piece of grass, watching Margaret carry buckets of feed to the barn. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of pity and amusement that men use when they think a woman is being sentimental. "Those birds are spent. You know that, right? They're not gonna lay. Not for you, not for anyone. You're pouring money into a hole in the ground." She smiled and kept walking. "Just trying to give them a good retirement, Tom." "Retirement?" He laughed, a short bark of sound. "They're chickens, Margaret. They don't get retirement, they get soup." Then came the Petersons from across the road. Linda Peterson drove her SUV up the long gravel driveway one Tuesday afternoon, her perfect nails tapping the steering wheel. She got out with a casserole dish in her hands, a neighborly gesture that Margaret recognized as reconnaissance. "Oh, honey," Linda said, peering into the barn. The smell of chicken droppings and fresh straw was strong, and Linda wrinkled her nose. "You can't seriously be keeping these things. They look diseased. They look like they came out of a horror movie. What will people think?" "They're recovering," Margaret said quietly. "Recovering?" Linda laughed, a high musical sound that carried no warmth. "Margaret, they're chickens. And they're ugly chickens. You should have bought some nice ones from the feed store. Something that would actually, produce." They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world, and even if they did, these weren't the old ways. This was just desperation dressed up as kindness. Margaret's daughter called again. "Mom, I looked up battery hens. Do you know what the mortality rate is for rescue hens? Do you know how much you're spending on feed?" I did the math. Even if every single one of those birds started laying tomorrow, you wouldn't break even for 2 years. And they won't start laying. "They're done, Sarah," Margaret said, looking out the kitchen window at the barn where soft clucking sounds drifted on the evening air. "Not everything is about breaking even." There was a long silence on the line. "Mom, I think you're depressed. I think this is about Dad. I think you're trying to save these chickens because you couldn't save him." Margaret closed her eyes. Her husband had died of cancer 2 years ago, slowly, in the bedroom down the hall. She had watched him fade, had held his hand at the end, had felt the exact moment when his fingers went slack in hers. She had failed to save him. She knew that. She carried that knowledge every day like a stone in her chest. But this wasn't about him. Or maybe in some way it was about all of it. About loss, about worth, about the things we throw away and the things we choose to keep. The first month 3 hens died. Margaret buried each one under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, wrapping them in flour sacks and saying a few words she made up as she went along. She cried for each one. She didn't try to hide it. Let the neighbors see her crying over chickens. Let them think she was crazy. She had stopped caring what they thought somewhere around the 3rd week, when she walked into the barn one morning and found Dorothy, the limping hen with the bare back, standing in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the barn door. Dorothy had her eyes half closed, her head tilted back, and for a moment, just a moment, Margaret could see what she might become. What they all might become, if given enough time and enough light. The predators came in the 2nd month. A fox, thin and desperate, started circling the property at dusk. Margaret saw it twice, a red shadow at the tree line. She didn't own a gun. She didn't believe in killing something just for trying to survive. Instead, she reinforced the barn with wire she scavenged from the dump. She closed the hens in every night at sunset. She sat on the porch with a flashlight and a broom, ready to make noise if the fox came close. Tom Henderson saw her one evening, sitting there in her bathrobe with a broom across her lap. "You're guarding chickens with a broom?" he called from his truck. He was laughing so hard he had to wipe his eyes. "Margaret, you need a dog, you need a gun, you need a husband, if we're being honest. You can't protect 50 birds with a broom." She didn't answer. She just watched his taillights disappear down the road, and she kept sitting there, night after night, the broom across her lap, the flashlight in her hand, the stars wheeling overhead. The feed bills were mounting. Margaret started skipping meals to make sure the hens had enough. She took extra shifts at the grocery store, coming home at 2 in the morning with her feet aching and her back screaming, only to wake up at 6 to mix feed and clean the barn. She sold her grandmother's silver tea set, the one thing of real value she had left, to buy a month of organic layer pellets and a used incubator she found at a yard sale. Sarah found out about the tea set and didn't speak to her for 2 weeks. "You're choosing chickens over your family," Sarah said when she finally called back, her voice cold and hurt. "You're choosing chickens over your future. Those birds are going to die, Mom, and when they do, you're going to have nothing left. Not even the tea set." Margaret looked at the hens, who were starting to look a little less skeletal now. Some of the bare patches on their backs were filling in with pin feathers, tiny shafts of promise pushing through scarred skin. Beatrice, the knife-edged hen, had started walking without her head hanging low. Clara, the one who had sat in the corner waiting to die, had taken her first dust bath 3 days ago, flopping in the dirt with a joy so pure it made Margaret laugh out loud. They weren't laying yet. Not a single egg. Their bodies were still healing, still rebuilding, still deciding whether this new world was worth trusting. But they were alive, and they were trying. And that was more than Margaret had been able to say about herself for a very long time. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 4 months after the auction. Margaret had been up since 5 as usual, mixing feed, carrying water, checking the nesting boxes. She didn't expect to find anything. She had stopped expecting to find anything. She had started to believe in the quiet hours of the night that maybe everyone was right. Maybe these hens were done. Maybe she had thrown away her last resources on a beautiful, stupid dream. She was cleaning the east corner of the barn when she heard it. A soft, insistent clucking from one of the nesting boxes. Not the usual random noise of hens settling. Something different, something urgent. Margaret walked over, her heart suddenly beating too fast. She looked into the box. Dorothy was in there. Dorothy, the limping hen with the bare back, the one who had stood in the sunlight that first month. And beneath her, warm and impossibly small, was an egg. Margaret's hands shook as she reached in. The egg was smaller than a store-bought egg, and the shell was slightly rough, slightly misshapen, but it was perfect. It was the most perfect thing she had ever seen. She took it into the kitchen. She held it up to the light. She boiled it, because she couldn't wait, because she had to know, and when she cracked it open, the yolk that spilled out was the color of a sunset, deep orange, almost red. A color that didn't look like it came from a chicken, but from something magical. Margaret sat at her kitchen table and cried. She cried because it was beautiful. She cried because it meant they were healing. She cried because for the first time in 2 years, she had done something that worked. She had taken something broken and helped it become whole. But she didn't know, not yet, what that egg really meant. The next day, there were 3 eggs, then 5, then 8. By the end of the week, 20 of the hens were laying. Small eggs at first, misshapen, with shells that were sometimes too soft or too thick, but every single one had that yolk. That impossible deep orange yolk that looked like it had been painted by an artist who only worked in sunsets. Margaret started eating them herself, giving them to the neighbors who would take them. She didn't tell anyone about the color at first. She didn't think it mattered. They were just eggs. Then she brought a dozen to the grocery store where she worked. She gave them to her manager, Patricia, who had always been kind to her. "From your chickens?" Patricia asked, skeptical. "Margaret, those birds were half dead. Are these even safe?" "Try them," Margaret said. Patricia made scrambled eggs in the break room the next morning. She took one bite, then another. Then she called Margaret into the office. "Where did you get these?" Patricia asked, her eyes wide. "My hens, the rescue hens. Margaret, these are the best eggs I've ever tasted. The color alone, my husband is a chef at the farmhouse bistro. You need to bring him a dozen. Today." Margaret didn't understand. They were just eggs. They were just the product of some scraggly, half-dead birds that everyone had laughed at, but she brought the eggs. And Chef Michael looked at them the way a man looks at something he has been searching for his whole life without knowing it. "These are pasture-raised?" he asked, turning the egg in his hand. "Yes. They roam the barn and the yard. They eat bugs and grass and whatever they find. And the yolk, this color, this is what an egg is supposed to look like. This is what an egg is supposed to taste like." He looked at her with sudden intensity. "How many can you produce?" "I don't know. Maybe a dozen a day right now. Maybe more as they recover. I'll buy everything you have, every single egg. I'll pay you $3 a dozen. No, 4. I'll pay you $4 a dozen, and I'll tell every chef in the county about you." Margaret stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse bistro, holding her empty egg carton, and she felt the world shift beneath her feet. $4 a dozen, 4 times what the grocery store charged. And he wanted everything. Word spread the way word always spreads in small towns, slowly at first, then all at once. Chef Michael put her eggs on the menu. He called them sunset yolks and charged a premium for them. Food bloggers came to photograph dishes with that impossible orange yolk running across sourdough toast, pooling beside asparagus, staining hollandaise sauce the color of autumn leaves. Margaret's phone started ringing. Then it didn't stop. The farmer's market, which she had been too intimidated to join, invited her to set up a booth. She brought 3 dozen eggs the first Saturday, nervous, her hands shaking as she arranged them in reused cartons with her handwriting on the top. Margaret's rescue eggs, pasture raised. Loved, they sold out in 45 minutes. The next week she brought 6 dozen. They sold out in 30 minutes. The week after that she brought 10 dozen. They sold out in 20 minutes. People started lining up before she arrived. They came with their own cartons, their own bags, stories about how they had never tasted eggs like this. A woman from the city drove 2 hours because her son had allergies and could only eat Margaret's eggs without reacting. A nutritionist wrote a blog post about the omega-3 content and the vitamin D levels. A local news station did a segment on the Chicken Lady of Henderson County, showing footage of Margaret walking among her hens, who now had full feathers and bright combs and eyes that shone with life. The hens that had been ugly were beautiful now. Not the kind of beauty that wins ribbons at the fair, but something deeper. They had iridescent feathers in shades of brown and gold and black. They moved with confidence, scratching and dust-bathing and chasing grasshoppers across the yard. They had personalities. Dorothy was still the boss, limping slightly but ruling the roost with an iron will. Beatrice had become the escape artist, always finding the one gap in the fence. Clara had turned into a mother, adopting the new chicks that Margaret had started hatching in the used incubator, teaching them to find worms and take dust baths. The neighbors started coming by again. But this time, they weren't laughing. Tom Henderson appeared at her fence line one morning, his hat in his hands, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough, "I was wondering, my wife sent me. She wants to know if you have any eggs left. She tried some at the bistro last week. Said they were different. Better." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. She could have said a lot of things. She could have reminded him of the laughter, the pity, the way he had told her she needed a husband. But she saw something in his face that she recognized. She saw a man who had been wrong, and who knew it, and who didn't know how to say it. "I'll save you a dozen, Tom," she said softly. "Come by Saturday." Linda Peterson came too, her SUV crunching up the driveway, her perfect nails now wrapped around a $5 bill. "Margaret, I had no idea," Linda said, her voice breathy with the particular enthusiasm of someone who senses a trend. "These eggs are everywhere. Everyone's talking about them. I was telling my book club just yesterday that I always knew you had a gift for this. Always." Margaret took her money and gave her the eggs. She didn't say much. She had learned that the words of people who laugh first and admire later are like wind through grass. They're one moment, gone the next, leaving no trace. Sarah came to visit. She stood in the barn watching the hens, watching her mother move among them with a confidence and peace she hadn't seen in years. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice thick, "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I thought you were being foolish. I thought you were throwing your life away, but look at this. Look at you." Margaret put her arm around her daughter. The hens clucked and scratched around their feet, a soft symphony of contentment. "I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong, Sarah. I was just trying to do something good. And sometimes, when you do something good without expecting anything back, the world gives you more than you dared to hope for." By the 8th month, Margaret had quit her job at the grocery store. She had hired 2 local teenagers to help with the morning chores. She had expanded the barn, built a second pasture, and installed a proper walk-in cooler for the eggs. She was producing 50 dozen eggs a week, and every single one was spoken for before it was laid. The farmer's market had given her the prime spot, the corner under the oak tree where the line formed at dawn and stretched around the block. She had to start a waiting list. She had to start limiting customers to 2 dozen apiece so that everyone could get some. The eggs that had come from the ugliest, most broken birds anyone had ever seen were now the most sought-after food in the county. And the birds themselves? They were famous. People came just to see them, to take pictures of the hens that had been thrown away and had found their way back to life. Children drew pictures of Dorothy and Beatrice and Clara. A local artist painted a mural of them on the side of the feed store, 50 hens in all their feathered glory with the words, "Every life is worth saving." Margaret stood in her barn on a morning in late spring, 8 months after the auction, and she listened to the sound of 50 hens living their lives in the sunlight. She thought about the morning she had stood in the cold, about the laughter, about the $25 that had been everything she had and nothing to lose. She thought about the woman she had been then, tired, broken, afraid that her best years were behind her, afraid that she was as spent and useless as those hens had appeared to be. And she looked at what they had built together, the woman and the birds, the broken and the brave, the ones nobody wanted, who had found each other and made something extraordinary. The world will always have a way of looking at the surface and deciding what something is worth. It will see the bare patches and the limping gait and the dull eyes, and it will say, used up, broken. Not worth the effort, but life, real life, doesn't happen on the surface. It happens in the slow, stubborn work of healing. It happens in the quiet moments when someone chooses to believe in something that the world has thrown away. It happens when a woman with $25 and a broken heart looks at 50 broken birds and sees not waste, but possibility. Margaret didn't save those hens because she was special. She didn't save them because she was wise, or because she had some secret knowledge that others lacked. She saved them because she looked at them, really looked at them, and she saw something that the auction crowd couldn't see. She saw life, she saw worth, she saw the spark that refuses to go out, even in the darkest places, and in saving them, she saved herself. She found her purpose in their recovery. She found her voice in their story. She found her community in the people who lined up at dawn for eggs that tasted like sunlight and hope. She found that the things we do for love, without expectation of return, are the things that return to us multiplied beyond measure. The old ways, the ways of patience, of compassion, of believing in the potential of the broken and the cast-off, those ways never really go out of style. They just wait for someone brave enough to practice them. They wait for someone willing to sit with a broom across her lap, guarding chickens from a fox, while the world laughs and drives away. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, not because they are easier, not because they are faster, but because they remind us of what matters. They remind us that every living thing carries a spark of the divine. They remind us that the measure of a life is not in its productivity, but in its capacity to love and be loved. Margaret's hens still wake her every morning at dawn. She still carries buckets of feed through the dewy grass. She still names every new bird that comes into her care, because names matter, because recognition matters, because every life deserves to be seen. And every Saturday, when the line forms around the oak tree and people wait for hours just to hold a carton of her eggs, she thinks about the auction. She thinks about the laughter. She thinks about the man who said those birds were dead already. They just didn't know it yet. She wishes he could see them now. She wishes he could see what happens when you refuse to give up on something that the world has given up on. She wishes he could taste the sunrise in those yolks and understand that the best things in life are often the ones we have to fight for, the ones that require us to look past the surface and see the soul beneath. They laughed at her methods. They called her foolish. They said the old ways had no place in the modern world. But Margaret knows the truth. She knows it in her bones, in her heart, in the quiet clucking of 50 hens who were given a second chance and turned it into a miracle. The old ways are not dead. They are just waiting. Waiting for someone with enough courage to pick up a broom, to look a broken thing in the eye and to say, "Not today, not on my watch, not while I have breath to fight for you." And sometimes, when the morning is clear and the light is golden and the eggs are warm in her hands, Margaret thinks that maybe this is what she was always meant to do. Not organizing books, not stocking shelves, not living a small, safe life that never risked anything. Maybe she was meant to stand in the back corner of an auction, raise her hand and say yes to the broken things. Maybe she was meant to learn that the only way to heal the world is to start by healing one small, forgotten piece of it at a time. Maybe we all are.